When I was at Stanford and I came back to Australia and I started to speak with people about what I had seen in Silicon Valley with the initial growth of the internet, everybody thought I was completely certifiably nuts.
Welcome to Random VC, a podcast where we discuss random topics around venture capital, innovation, investments, and people. I'm your host, Maria Halasz, and I would like to thank our sponsors, Stride Equity and the Nudge Group. My guest today is Tony Surtees. And Tony was named one of Australia's top 10 digital entrepreneurs by Smart Company alongside Atlassian founders Mike Cannon-Brookes and Scott Farquhar. Tony chaired the government's Entrepreneurs Program Committee for many years, and under Tony's watch, the program funded over 650 startups, including Canva. More about that later. Tony is also a co-founder of Zeetings, a cloud-based interactive presentation platform. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It was acquired by Canva in 2017 and still is the technology powering their platform and has been used in over 1 billion presentations globally. Tony spent time in Silicon Valley and in Asia as VP of Yahoo Inc., where he was responsible for running 14 product verticals as VP of Yahoo Commerce. I hope I got that right.
You did.
And he was generating 2.5 billion revenue within the group and creating new services and business models. Currently, Tony is president of the Stanford Australia Association, sits on the federal government's working groups for both blockchain and AI, and he's also on the board of the Menzies Foundation, which is a leadership institute. Tony, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Tony, I would like to start with your professional background. And we're both of Hungarian origin. Of course, you were born in Australia. I was born in Hungary. But I was fortunate enough to know your father, who was an architect.
That's correct, and I apologize.
But you're not an architect, and I also know that both of your parents were Holocaust survivors. So
yeah.
I'm interested in your childhood and how that framed your career.
Look, I grew up with a generation of people who were extraordinary in their survival skills, and they had just sheerly by need, if nothing else. They had to develop entrepreneurial skills as well as survival skills as they came penniless as refugees to Australia. And I would routinely look at what this generation of people would do and the benefits that being born in Australia from this particular group of people really made available to me and my generation. And it was curious because up until a certain age, I sort of didn't know that anybody had a language other than this way to speak. It was completely normal. And so when I started to confront Australians, it was a curiosity, but I became used to it.
It's really funny that you say the accent, because my daughter is 24. And she just told me that she was around 12 or 13 when she noticed that I had an accent. Right up to then, she didn't know I had one.
Yeah, it's curious. I mean, when you grow up to it, it's just completely normal. So you don't pick it up. My parents would go overseas and they would say things like, "Well, people would ask us where are we coming from? We say Australia, and we couldn't understand why they did not understand."
So familiar. Anyway, so how does that background then frame your decision to become an entrepreneur, essentially? But obviously you had to study something and you had to think through, how do I get there?
I think again, I looked at the role models of people who were around me. The people who, and the story behind who created Westfield, and who created Best and Less, and who created a range of these different businesses. and what were their backstories, and having been able to tolerate enormous amounts of uncertainty and risk, one thing was made very clear, and that having the ambition that many people of my age would have had to take on professional qualifications and then work, in legal or medical. I had no interest in doing any of those things. I was interested in getting a certain amount of navigation skills, survival in a large organization, effectively developing a personal brand at organizations that had a strong international focus. So I was very keen to develop this capacity to navigate and also to build my own business. So for many years I had my own business as I was going through high school and also university, and I was a disc jockey, so I leveraged my debating skills by getting in front of a whole lot of people on a regular basis, and that was actually proved to be quite useful. When Steve Jobs says, the dots don't connect until many years later, it worked out that I was perfectly comfortable getting in front of a camera or getting in front of a group of people simply because of all those years of having to stand up in front of large numbers of people and try to entertain them. Not always successfully, but that was useful and also led me to effectively going in and negotiating with record companies to get free records and then trading that into becoming a research tool for them to actually demonstrate which of these new releases, pre-release, were actually working on a dance floor. So these were the sort of things that when you start with nothing, you develop into being creative in terms of how you create value for your business partners or people who you were trying to work with.
At some point, you ended up in the US. How did that come about, and then at Stanford?
I always had, I'd say, not even an ambition. It was almost an obligation to do the best that I could with what I had. And as far as I was concerned, certainly growing up in the 60s and 70s, the US was clearly, the place that you wanted to go if you had entrepreneurial ambitions. This was, ground zero in terms of where entrepreneurship was really emerging from and creating global companies. So the first company I went to go work with full time was TNT. And I don't know if I told you this story, but the way I first got into TNT is when I graduated from marketing at UNSW. I was very unimpressed with the idea of going to the University Employment Center and then lining up with everybody else to go and get an internship at Reckitt and Coleman or any one of the P&G type businesses. So I decided that I should actually use my marketing qualifications in a slightly unusual way. I had long had a theory in studying advertising that the people who were most watching in an industrial or commercial circumstance, what's in a supplement, a magazine supplement or a newspaper supplement, were the people who advertised in that supplement to actually check to see how their ad went. The Financial Review had a marketing supplement, and so I decided to take out a quarter-page ad and I advertised myself.
That's great. I love it.
So there were two interesting things that came out of it. The first was I had 27 job offers that came out of that within a week.
Amazing.
And the second thing was my lecturer in marketing at the time was not entirely impressed that I did this and asked me to explain myself. And my explanation was quite simple. I did this because nobody else did. And I felt that if I was going to use at least some of the skill set that I'd acquired, this was going to be a logical way of doing it. It was $134 at that point, and it was very efficient.
Well, we've been friends for a while, but I haven't heard that story, and it's quite incredible, I have to say. No, that's amazing. But So you started at TNT in the US or in
Oh,
Australia?
here in Australia.
Here in Australia. And then how did you end up in the US?
So my ambition was to always go and do a master's degree in business. When I was early in my career, unfortunately, I came down with a particular medical condition, which basically meant I was in and out of hospital constantly for about 6 years. And I was very determined at the end of that to actually go and say, well, once that's over and done with, I'm going to go and pursue an MBA or a master's somewhere. So I applied to 3 different universities and got into each of them. And but the one that actually I found most appealing was Stanford, and they had, clearly being located at the, center of Silicon Valley, clearly, provided an enormous degree of interest and curiosity, and for me, met all my criteria.
So you ended up having a master's from Stanford.
That's correct.
And did you stay in the US or you came back to Australia?
Initially came back, then started a small business in telecommunications. I then sold that business, and then as I was selling that particular business, it became quite apparent to me that there was an emerging opportunity coming out of Silicon Valley, and that opportunity was online auctions, and that was eBay. So that's what led me to Yahoo.
And you got to Yahoo, and what was your first job there?
Well, I was asked to go and start what was Yahoo Auctions. And that was an interesting exercise for Yahoo because they had divergent objectives. On one hand, eBay was one of their biggest advertising clients. And on the other hand, they had an ambition to become big in e-commerce anyway. So the challenge was, how could you actually start a business that was going to be competing with your largest advertiser? And so that was effectively the challenge. How would you go about doing that? Partway along that process, there was also a strategy to perhaps acquire eBay. And we went, I'd say, 95% through that particular process, and it stopped at the last minute. So my responsibility was to grow initially the Yahoo Auctions platform in multiple countries, and then I was promoted to take on and develop Yahoo Finance, which was at the time that I started that role. In that role, it was the world's largest personal finance site, and I'm glad to say that it remained and still does today to be the world's largest personal finance site. But we created a wide range of other verticals as well, including personals, Yahoo Classified, store, shopping, and we did that in partnership with multiple different organisations in multiple different countries, from Asia through to Europe and in Australia as well.
Well, those of our listeners who were born in 2000 and beyond, that was what year?
So I started in early 99 and ended in 2000, late 2000, early 2001.
So that was at the very kind of tricky period of the meltdown of all the internet bubble and the meltdown of some of the companies. So Yahoo certainly wasn't the size of company that it is now, is it?
No, I mean, I think Yahoo had started in 95 as a public company and grew enormously. So by the time I'd gotten there, the first generation of managers had actually moved up, and I was at the time the most senior person they recruited from outside to be effectively the second generation of management there. Interestingly enough, if you look at where Yahoo is today, it's effectively re-emerging. As after having gone through multiple ownerships, it's exited from being a public company to then being a private company, being born by also being owned by Verizon. Sorry about that. Being owned by Verizon, and then private equity bought the business out, and it's now positioning itself as in a similar way to Reddit, which is now being enormously popular and successful in extracting, deep behavioral data on, narrow verticals of interest. Yahoo has the same capability, and it's emerging as a sort of the good internet, as they put a label on it, in terms of being able to provide, again, this focus on narrow verticals that are catering to specific deep interests in key areas where users who are highly qualified come to.
That's really interesting how it's transitioned over the last 25, 30 years. And when you consider how it emerged from search engine and that fight with Google, and obviously Google came out on top on that one, but then it's reimagining itself in a different vertical.
And I think it's also interesting, Yahoo was never a search engine. Yahoo actually subcontracted its search, or what was its directory, and so it was actually buying search services from Google. And in fact, there's a great set of reporting by Kara Swisher in her new book, The Burn Book. And she talks a lot about how she warned Jerry Yang at the time, saying, look, Google is eating your lunch and they're stealing your traffic. And at the time, it was regarded as saying, no, we're actually making a lot of money off the traffic that Google capabilities are providing. So it was an interesting set of transitions. And I think there was also a period of time when Yahoo saw itself very much as a content business. But it also, and it's not well understood, but Yahoo is also the place where a lot of core internet technology was developed. So Hadoop and a lot of server scaling capabilities were actually developed by our CTO and his team. His nickname is Zod, but Farzad Nazim, led this particular group of people, was there from the very beginning. And in fact, he was the person who introduced me to Jerry early on. So, tracking Yahoo is a really good way of understanding how this industry has matured through its worst times and through its best times.
And clearly you've seen a lot of startups and scale-up situations within Yahoo, and outside, obviously, you were in the right industry. So I want to bring you back now to Australia. At some point you returned to Australia.
That's what my parents said too.
And you're back in Australia, and what was your impression of the startup scene in Australia when you got back from Silicon Valley in particular? Firstly, what year was that when you got back?
When I first got back after Yahoo, so I actually didn't move straight back to Australia post Yahoo. I actually moved to Hong Kong, and there I was partially responsible for taking a small investment that Henry Kravis privately and a group from KKR had funded in Hong Kong, which was going to start to be an online auctions business. And then we migrated that to become the world's first mobile phone-based wallet. And we had developed this technology out of other technology that in an online auctions perspective was no longer usable because the online auctions market in Hong Kong and China and Asia at the time was too immature. But there was a big problem in e-commerce in around trust and buying things online. So we developed this company called eMyMy, and I infamously or otherwise was quoted on CNBC referring to the mobile phone as the remote control to life. And I get teased about that regularly at home. But in my view, when I said that on CNBC, it was 2001. And this was, 5 years before the iPhone. It proved to be very much the case. If you look at how people behave and the relationship they have with their phones, I think it's increasingly become the remote control to life.
Well, I think now it's replacing our life sometimes.
Well, I hope not.
Or real life anyway.
Yeah.
Many of our new generations are living off living their life on a screen instead of really going out there. So, but that's a completely different topic we could probably talk about for another hour. So you're in Hong Kong. You set up this
Imamai, yeah.
new company that is based on technology, never existed before. So you kind of really again repeating that the visionary, that the technological visionary that you kind of have shown before, and then you end up coming back to Australia, and that was in early 2000s.
That would have been about 2002, and my impression of the startup ecosystem at that point was that it would be generous to call it nascent. It was certainly subscale. There were a handful of very early and very courageous fund managers who, Roger Allen and Roger Buckridge, who had taken the mantle of trying to develop up a funding mechanism for early stage businesses to be able to receive funding. There were no federal government or government sponsored programs at the time, so it was very, very early, and it was in trying to reconcile where Silicon Valley was and where Australia was at the time. It was enormously frustrating to try to find legitimacy in understanding that venture capital was a legitimate and manageable asset class. And I think it took many years for it to get going, but it certainly has now.
I mean, the government, I think, first came on the scene in 2007 with the Innovation Investment Fund. I think that was the very first program that ultimately provided a little bit of money, and it was matching funding, and it was in the tens of millions. And, if you consider the size of the U.S. Venture market, and even if you, take it down by population, to the Australian market, I mean, we had nothing anywhere near.
Yeah. But I mean, if you looked at the world across multiple markets, apart from Silicon Valley, if you looked at Boston, the ecosystem, or the Seattle ecosystem, if you looked at the emerging ecosystem that came out of the BIRD scheme in Israel to actually provide early stage funding for the science-backed businesses that were going early through commercialization. If you looked at many of these ecosystems, they had recognized that early stage businesses were the principal driver of new employment and was the principal driver of an enormous amount of economic growth. And Australia, curiously, then and still now, is in the top 10 of world creators of the OECD of IP and scientific knowledge and patents, but very poor in the bottom 10% of countries that would commercialize these ventures. So it's not just against Silicon Valley that Australia was competing. It was against an emerging cohort of different clusters of activity in different cities around the world. And you've seen Singapore come out of nowhere. You've seen London and the UK essentially come out of having a very, very poor background other than in retail. So there are lots of ecosystems that are competing to become effective clusters of activity where this commercialization can take place.
And I mean, I just read it this morning in the Fin Review that Brandon Capital was one of the first beneficiaries of the IIF Innovation Investment Fund and has been subsequent regular beneficiary of the Medical Research Future Fund. They have now been managing over $1 billion since 2007. Yet when you look at our medical research industry, and just referring to the point about not being terribly good at taking things to commercialization, I mean, we still don't have a drug in Australia that we've invented. We've taken it through clinical trials, we commercialize and we own. We still don't have that. And, of course, Brandon Capital is the largest beneficiary of government funding and super funds support, but there are others out there And, as it is true for medical research, it's true for all the other technologies, I'm afraid. So we're still in that boat, aren't we? We've got a few wins, not medical technology, but we've got a Wi-Fi and some other wins that we kind of managed to make some money out of, and the CSIR is a big beneficiary of that. But I think we've still got a long way to go.
I mean, look, Australia has got a very significant community of people who, again, do raw scientific research, and we have devoted significant human capital and financial capital into the early stage development of lots of these capabilities. The problem is the commercialization, and you need scale to be able to do that. I just came now, in fact, this is why I was running late, from a lunch from a global biotech fund, and they really talk in terms of how they have performed over the last 25 years, given the fact that they, as an innovation fund, look at the entire pipeline of biotech development and biotech commercialization. And the IRR of that as a fund is actually very impressive. But they do have the resources, they have the team, and they have the financial assets to be able to, really be a very active contributor to the commercialization process. And they're deeply integrated with the big drug companies, and so they understand from one extreme end to the other exactly what that pipeline looks like. And they have the capacity to be able to go both short and long on different biotech and medical investments, public and private. So again, these are the sort of things where we in Australia have to understand what the commercialization ecosystem in different verticals, in different industries, actually looks like, and what it takes for us to build resilience and capability in Australia on a global basis.
So let's talk about our startups in Australia today. And, with all the new technologies emerging in the last few years, we've never seen so many AI startups and, quantum computing and, robotics. Let's not talk about medical technologies. Obviously, we've got a few of those. So how do you see the landscape now? Should these companies, particularly the companies around AI or robotics, should they just pack up and go to the US? Or you've just outlined how difficult it is to get into, a system where the commercialization and all those different verticals can open up for companies.
So there's no standard answer to that question. I think, in my view, there's a really viable and logical pathway for Australian businesses like Canva to remain with their head office in Australia for a number of reasons. Getting qualified engineers and keeping ongoing employment here. Costs are lower in a lot of different ways, or in many circumstances. And the capacity to be able to engage and create remote centres of development while still keeping their head office in Australia is completely viable. But even if you talk about much smaller organisations, again, for an early stage business, you need to be able to have access to where your customers are. And so for some businesses, it's logical to go early to engage in the US. For some businesses, it's logical to engage early in Singapore or Hong Kong or China or Europe or South America. And so when you're making these decisions, the questions have got to be, what is my cost of customer acquisition? And what is the state of the particular market that I'm targeting? And how can I get to scale most effectively under different circumstances? So it is not inevitable that you pack up and move to the US. It is certainly inevitable that any business that wants to get to global scale has to engage with large markets. And wherever those large markets are, you need to be able to meet the market where it is and understand what the dynamics of demand in that particular market are. So it just depends. When Canva started, it was a 3-person business in Perth doing design templates for high school yearbooks. But they had a compelling initial vision, which they've stuck to, which is really empowering the capability of being able to engage in aesthetically pleasing and effective design, which is a global need. And I think they were very intelligent in that they very early on engaged in multiple languages other than English. And a lot of their early growth really came out of these languages that weren't in English, but required the support and that required access to a useful design tool. So essentially you need to be able to look at the strengths and the opportunities that each market represents. But I think what is in common is you need to be thinking about global marketplaces, not an Australian marketplace, for the vast majority of the sorts of businesses that we would necessarily want to support.
And you mentioned Canva a couple of times, and I'm really curious that at that time, when it was a 3-person, Perth-based little company, and they've come to what was Commercialisation Australia at the time, and you were on the board of the committee, or on the committee, selection committee, and you must have seen thousands of companies applying for these government grants. But Canva was one of the companies that got a really early check from the government. What did you see in them? I mean, was that compelling vision that you've just described, that they had that vision, that they wanted to create these visually attractive tools for people to easily assemble and communicate businesses or ideas?
Well, I think going back to that initial engagement, there were a couple of things. I think the first thing is that they had a niche market that they were going after, and they were enabling schools to be able to do a particular type of design which they found very difficult to do, and they were automating aspects of that. I don't recall them having the global vision that I've articulated now at that time. And there were many, many design companies coming out of Australia, and there were countless businesses over the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years, 99 designs. There were multiple businesses coming from multiple different countries, all aimed at that sort of design space. I think clearly one of the big wins that we didn't see, but then the invisible hand of success, if I would put it this way, when Bill Tye came on as an early investor and backed Melanie and Cliff's vision. That, I think, opened up an understanding of exactly how large that market could be. And his backing in particular brought in people like Guy Kawasaki to become an international advocate of that as a business. And I recall actually going to a conference that Bill was holding, one of his kite surfing conferences, and listening to Mel actually present at that particular conference. This was years later. And you could see that global vision really coming together. And I think they became not only determined, but they became extremely professional at being able to articulate that big vision and the capacity to be able to deliver to it.
So where is that global vision taking Canva next? Particularly in the context of AI and all these tools that are coming out?
I think they are now engaging in the big enterprise end of the market with the recent launch of the new applications that they have. And I think that they're increasingly becoming an environment and a broad platform upon which large numbers of people who are sensitive to being able to improve communication and to be able to have insightful ways of being persuasive, they are becoming the dominant player. and the AI technologies are enabling simplicity and intelligence and process automation to make that investment in time by somebody on that platform to be much more productive. Now, beyond that, I'm not the first analyst to, identify Canva, but I'm clearly biased, having seen their performance. But I think one of the key things they've also done, and it's not their primary objective, is they've reset expectations about what is possible from an Australian base. And I think that's a really important element to that overall story.
Oh, absolutely. And their spectacular success, I think, is just amazing. Everyone knows Canva.
There's one more thing that they've done. I wrote about this recently, just on Canva for a moment. So our team, our Zeetings team, which is a very small team, migrated across to be employed by Canva, and they're all still there. And our CEO of Zeetings is now their head of product. So Rob Kowalski has been leading their development of product in this global marketplace. And it's really interesting. Most often, when large businesses acquire small ones, they destroy the culture or they destroy the competitiveness of the team that they acquire. But not so there. In this particular situation, they've preserved it and they've enlarged it and they've engaged that team who is still there in Canva. And I think that that's an ability to be able to do that with the companies that you're acquiring says a lot about the sophistication and the understanding of how to scale a business, because businesses don't just scale organically, they scale by acquisition as well. But most large organizations make a hash of that. And the fact that they, at least in my experience, have done so well in that particular case really speaks volumes about their capacity to continue growing at the speed at which they're growing now.
Yeah, that's very, very impressive. And talking about the future, let's stick with the future. In 2001, you predicted that the telephone will be the remote control of life, and that we know that in long distance or long term, we tend to underestimate the effect of new technologies. What do you think is going to surprise us or would surprise us in 10 years' time if we'd gone there with our current eyes? What would be that technology or that trend that will be much more effective or have much bigger effect on our lives than we think today?
I think the capacity to harness AI in ways that we don't currently expect in terms of process automation, and the ability to create, let's say, subsidiary technologies, which will actually be technology creating new technology. It's the second and third order impact of, for example, how code can be written out of AI systems to develop new capabilities. It's very hard to predict. Well, I'll put it this way. When I was at Stanford and I came back to Australia and I started to speak with people about what I had seen in Silicon Valley with the initial growth of the internet, everybody thought I was completely certifiably nuts. And I look at what's happening today, just today, and I say, this is like 93, 94 again, but at 10 times the scale and probably an equivalent speed. It was very hard, if not impossible, to predict what the downstream opportunity for the internet was in 93 and 94 and 95. And I think it's just as impossible, if not more impossible, now to be able to accurately predict the specific areas where the impact will be most felt. There are negative consequences to technology when it's not used properly. So if you think about cybersecurity, if you think about misinformation and disinformation, if you think about how society is increasingly dominated by narrow echo chambers where people aren't necessarily exchanging ideas as much as a society with common philosophies would do. I think that a lot of this technology, the new developments ought to be in terms of improving outcomes for society, not just from a technology point of view, but that point at which technology and society has to interact in important ways. And we're still at the relatively early phase in a couple of hundred years of massive technology change to see how society changes shape. So I remember that I was asked at a conference, it was actually Comdeck many years ago, and I was there on behalf of Yahoo. The question was, well, Yahoo has grown so much in this period of time, don't you think it's going to run out of room? Like, it'll run out of market. And at that point, only about 15% of the world was online. You look at it now, and you look at the ubiquity of anyone, anywhere in any country to get access to, with Skylink, with broadband, the capacity for these enormous productive capabilities to be able to make an impact in second world and third world countries. The productivity opportunities that will come out of that are unfathomable. And so there are deep needs that at government level to think about what forms of protection need to be built into our legal system, what sort of governance needs to be imposed on internet publishing. And I'm very much of the belief that when the US decided, I think it's Section 120, where it's the legislation which basically means online media businesses, including social media, which hadn't been imagined at that point, could not be sued. They weren't held responsible for editorial oversight. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
I think that needs to be reversed because these large organizations have the capacity, they have the technical capacity, and they have the financial capacity to actually solve these problems and take on the responsibilities that a large publisher actually would have. And if you think about it, and you go back a bit, in the early 1900s, when radio first appeared, and then in the 40s and the 50s when television appeared, there was a recognition by government that you were taking bandwidth, you were taking radio waves, and you were basically taking this as a free public good and you were privatizing it. And then in return for a private organization to make money out of this free public good, they needed to behave in a particular way. They needed to be licensed and there needed to be regulations. The fact that the internet was supported in the way that it was, without any obligations and without any licensing requirements, should probably have been necessary at the time to grow that industry.
Of course.
But we're long past that time. We're not in any doubt whatsoever that these organizations, which are the most financially powerful in the world, now need to have regulation imposed on them, and there need to be sensible regulation to prevent the negative impacts that we're all seeing around us.
Well, I think we're seeing that changing. I think the challenge to these large platforms is out there. They've got huge teams now in the background working around, editing and culling information that might not be genuine or authentic. So I think we're definitely seeing that emerging, and I agree with you. It's really important. I think we're towards the end of our conversation, but we
only just started. What are you talking about? We were just getting into it.
Exactly. So we've got random 5, where we give you 5 random questions, and I'm going to come out with a quick answer, please. What's your best childhood memory? Favorite childhood memory?
Going on the Manly ferry with my grandmother, who spoke no English at the time, and in her broken Hungarian or half Hungarian, half German, navigating through a city. I loved getting on the water, and that was just probably and she brought me up for many of the first years, and she spoke no English, and I had to translate for her to everybody, and that was really, something which I, probably going all the way back, that would be probably one of my fondest memories.
Give me a book that you've read and you'd love to read it like you've never read it before again.
Peter Diamandis's book, Bold,
Bold.
which really is an exploration as to the impact of exponential thinking.
Who is the person you most look up to?
I don't know that I can necessarily identify a single individual that I most look up to. I think there are lots of examples of people who have been, heroic in my life, even if I had no contact with them. So, ironically, so my mother, who was in Bergen-Belsen, and she was actually one of the people rescued by Wallenberg, who was the Swedish diplomat who then effectively sent many people to Sweden. This is a person who had risked his life and probably ultimately perished because of the things that he did as to protect, the broader community. So, if I were to randomly say that, that would be one of the people I would point to.
Then, if you organized a really special dinner, you could invite anyone, any 5 people, dead or alive. Who would be the 5 people you'd invite?
Well, Winston Churchill would have to be one. I think a strange one that you probably would laugh at, but there was this leader of the Jewish community in New York, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, simply because he has such an extraordinary impact in very curious ways, and I'd love to hear what he would interpret about a whole bunch of different things. I think Bob Hawke, who I'd met a number of times and spoke to, as clearly one of the most unusual intellects coming out of Australia, and a terrible singer. Terrible singer.
But a good drinker.
Manifestly, yes. In fact, when you go on a tour of Oxford, they point to the pub that he was at where he created the Oxford's drinking record.
Oh, good heavens.
No, it's part of the walking tour. I think other people, I think I would be interested to have Steve Jobs in there. I think simply to try to get a better understanding as to what the psychology is. And
one more.
I think I'm just trying to think of the name. The person who established the engineering school at Stanford is a guy called Terman, Terman.
You'd like to have him? You would like to have him?
I think Terman, in terms of the vision that he had around creating the first generation of innovation in Silicon Valley when it was largely a farm and orange fields, is fascinating. And also the role that they played in the development of, for example, radar, prior to World War II, and a lot of different defense technologies, anticipating numerous problems that were occurring at the time. So I think he would be in there.
I've got a bonus question for you.
Jó Istenem.
Jó Istenem. Who's going to win the US election?
It is, practically speaking, impossible for Trump to win. Now, the rationale, and this is a debate I've had with lots of people. If you look at the record that Trump has had and the Republican Party has had since 2016, it's been failure after failure after failure after failure. In 2020, what was perfectly clear was the radicalization of the Republican Party in terms of these sorts of initiatives that Trump was backing, was shrinking the Republican base. Now, since that time, that shrinking has taken place even further. So what you see has happened in certainly the last 2 years is the supporters, the hardcore 25 to 30% of rusted-on Republican supporters, they are progressively, little by little, in different places, they are, either becoming disenchanted by what is going on. So, had in 2020 he had taken on the perspective of saying growing his base rather than shrinking it, then perhaps it would have been another outcome. The second rationale is that if you look at the mathematics of the states where he has to get a swing, he would need to get, and forget the hardcore Republicans and the hardcore Democrats, the undecided people or the independents who are in the middle, he would need to win over 80% of the independent voters to his side in order to win in those states. As it currently stands, probably 80% of those undecided or independent people are swinging to the Democratic side. So it would seem to be a mathematical impossibility for him to win. And I would say that notwithstanding the noise and the volume of the Trump supporters, I think it would be astonishing to see that he would be able to garner enough support.
Well, just to finish off, Tony, that was really interesting, and I certainly hope that you're right. What is the one advice that you would have for startup founders today in Australia?
Don't follow your passion. Follow your curiosity. And be prepared to do something that seems superficially incredibly boring, but where there's a market. And be prepared to put yourself in a position where you will take on the risk of demonstrating a market wherever that market happens to go. I firmly believe that the biggest risk you take is by not taking a risk. And the biggest risk you take is by stepping back from grabbing control of your own life in order to pursue a more safe career. Because what's safe today may be very unsafe or unsustainable going forward.
Thank you, Tony. And I think I'm going to have to get you back in there because we haven't gone through half of the questions that I had for you. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Not at all. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. We very much enjoyed this conversation with Tony Surtees, and we'll be back with more.